I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, if you can, please support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from returning guest Ralph Leonard, who recently wrote a piece in the publication UnHerd about the recent Joe Rogan Experience debate between libertarian anti-war comedian Dave Smith and the neocon commentator Douglas Murray. That piece was entitled Dave Smith, Douglas Murray, Debate Highlights Right-Wing Fault Line. It's going to be a rather interesting conversation as we're going to be dealing with the fragmentation on the right wing in America. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with Ralph Leonard. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm always happy to have on. I think we actually started talking around a year and a half ago when the Gaza war broke out. And, we've had this guest on a few times. Ralph Leonard has written for publications such as UnHerd and Compact Magazine. And he writes on just a number of issues: international politics, religion, and culture, as well as the issue of humanism. He comes from a sort of old school Marxist perspective, and I always enjoy his perspective. So how are you doing, Ralph?
I'm good.
Hopefully I wasn't too ineloquent in that introduction, but I wanted to talk with you because I enjoyed your piece in UnHerd on this Dave Smith, Douglas Murray debate. And maybe for people that don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit about who Dave Smith and Douglas Murray are and why this debate may actually matter. It's not just a spectacle.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, I think it is a bit of a spectacle, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, yeah. It's if you watch the whole thing, it is a bit entertaining because it reminds me of the meme, let them fight sort of thing. Um, so for your viewers, Dave Smith is a comedian, but who's also a prominent podcaster, political podcaster.
Very,
He
very much in the sort of
Rogan.
right-wing,
Yeah,
anti-war, libertarian camp. So I
yeah,
assume he would be aligned with people like Scott Horton,
yeah.
antiwar.com, that style of libertarian.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And he's a frequent guest or collaborator with Joe Rogan and that whole ecosystem. Uh, and obviously Dave Smith has been a little bit more prominent of recently because of the Israel-Gaza war, and his perspective is, if I guess you could call it an anti-Zionist perspective, that US foreign policy shouldn't be so supportive of Israel because look at what Israel is doing. And you know from his anti-war libertarian perspective, it's like, what's our business with this, that sort of thing. Whereas Douglas Murray is from the opposite perspective. He is a neoconservative English public intellectual slash writer, um, writes for The Spectator, the Free Press in the States, um, and is has made a name for himself of recent, being one of Israel's most public defenders, apologists, whatever word you want to use. So it was kind of interesting because when these two have gone together, because beforehand they've kind of fired shots at each other indirectly, whereas now with the Rogan podcast, they now talk to each other directly. And it's interesting because both of them represent two different perspectives on the right, mainly the American right, as to, you know, one is the anti-war libertarian perspective that Dave Smith represents. The other is a more traditional, neoconservative, or if not neoconservative, or establishment conservative perspective on Israel, US foreign policy. But it got very spicy, not just because of Israel, but also because Douglas Murray basically called out Joe Rogan and Dave Smith for basically platforming, you know, especially the one he used was Daryl Cooper, who is known for his World War II revisionism, and basically because he basically thinks Winston Churchill's the biggest villain of the Second World War. Now, for someone like Douglas Murray's perspective, calling Winston Churchill in particular the biggest villain of the Second World War is like really stepping on a few toes, because Douglas Murray, being from the political background he comes from, Churchill is held in high esteem. So, so that was quite interesting. Like this argument between what tradition, what you may call right wing isolationism, like libertarianism, versus neoconservatism, or establishment conservative ideas, is was interesting and kind of entertaining for someone, especially from my perspective, who thought they were both right and both wrong about each other.
One thing I want to get into, you noted there that this is about both sides, but you said both sides of the right, because I
Yeah,
think you're right about that. In a weird way, I don't even know that this debate that they had is completely just about Israel-Palestine.
yeah,
I'm not sure that that's really the concern that Dave Smith has. I think
no,
Dave Smith's concern is, well, why are we spending all this money, my taxpayer dollar, on giving weapons to this country that I don't
yeah,
think we need to? Why should we spend our tax
yeah,
dollars defending them? Which is a
yeah,
very different view than sort of the maybe social justice oriented view or internationalist view of, oh, there needs to be we need to help the Palestinians, as some on the left have. I think it's a very different view than the typical left-wing view. So I think this is very much situated in
yeah,
a right-wing debate.
yeah, and it's not that it's not as recent as people might think, because they were talking about Daryl Cooper, and obviously Dave Smith was kind of a bit more defensive about Daryl Cooper. And if you read into Daryl Cooper's view on the Second World War, it's really just a recycled version of Pat Buchanan's uh, writing on this topic, which basically holds that United States should not have gotten involved in Second World War.
I want to ask you this real
Yeah.
quick. Do you think that this is a hot topic or a hot question, but do you think the Buchanan Daryl Cooper view is Holocaust denial, or do you think it's more I'm not sure it's denial so much as it can lean in towards minimization.
Yeah, like I think it's more minimization and revisionism as opposed to out and out denial, because they kind of hold this perspective that Hitler was like a rational actor, and that Hitler was kind of boxed off into a corner by the United States intervening after Pearl Harbor that led to the Holocaust, if you see what I mean. That Hitler wasn't so much really an ideological uh and well, that his the Holocaust wasn't so much a part of an ideological project, but was like a sort of consequence of certain events produced by the war. But obviously, if you know the history of the Holocaust, that Hitler, that the Nazis started, their mass killings of Jews before Pearl Harbor occurred, after the invasion of the Soviet Union. They had already done Babi Yar, all the what was called the Holocaust by the bullets, where they killed what 1.5 million Jews by shooting them into mass graves in the space of what 7 months after June 1941. So because the problem is with that kind of view is that it has a, and this is one thing Douglas Murray is actually right on, is that they just see the world as the United States has the only agency to do anything, and everybody else is just reacting to it. Well, of course, in any kind of conflict, it takes two to tango. It's like it's not just obviously Hitler had his own agency and his own motivations to do what he wanted. So, and Douglas Murray is criticizing that perspective and transferring it to the Israel-Gaza war. So basically, he's saying to them that why are you always saying Israel's the only one who's doing anything? What about Hamas and their, as he would put it, death cult ideology?
So, in terms of where do you sort of agree and disagree with both of these figures? I
Well,
mean, for me, I'm not necessarily a big fan of either myself, and I
yeah,
kind of I think I may have a little bit different of a view on this. I sort of just rolled my eyes at the whole thing and was like, why is this the debate of debates that everyone
yeah,
is hearing? But go
yeah.
on.
Like Dave Smith is right when he says that when he counters Douglas Murray's call or about experts, that well, why don't about you know experts, because obviously you can use experts to justify anything. Um, it's like, and also which experts are you talking about to platform to balance out the whole discourse? Because let's take Israel-Palestine. If Joe Rogan talked to Avi Shlaim or Rashid Khalidi or even Norman Finkelstein or Ian Black, who wrote a very good book, I think very measured book, History of the Conflict. Uh, I don't think Douglas Murray would be happy with them. And they are mainstream, well, maybe not, Finkelstein's not really mainstream,
Well,
but you
I
know
was
what I
gonna
mean.
say the ones I mentioned were I think Dov Waxman wrote a pretty good book on Israel on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and even an Israeli like I don't know how to pronounce his first name, but Parath, who
Yeah,
was I mean he wasn't really for one side or the other, although he did become more right-wing around the time of the Oslo Accords, but he
yeah,
still kept his work very scholarly.
Yeah,
In a way that I would say Benny Morris went much further to the right and became more polemical. But you do have these writers on the conflict that are
yeah,
not that they're scholars first and polemicists second, and that's where I
yeah,
have the issue with Murray. We can get into that later, though. Go on.
yeah. Because, and I don't think Douglas Murray would be happy with that because I know he would say that they have their own agenda, anti-Israel, etc. And what I think bugs Douglas Murray about this whole thing is that his perspective isn't the default. That that his, if you will, pro-Israel, pro-neoconservative, pro-Western civilization, if you can call it that, like lens through which he views the Israel-Palestine question isn't the default. Isn't the is at least from Rogan's perspective. So then,
Or Smiths. Yeah.
yeah, or Smith's that there is this different view because of this Israel-Gaza war that he thinks is basically become more and more louder and dominant and is displacing the old mainstream view about Israel. And he finds that very threatening. And it's kind of obvious that's what bugs him about the Dave Smith, Joe Rogan view. And while Douglas Murray is right to uh raise up very legitimate points about Dave Smith and Joe Rogan because it's true. Joe Rogan does platform a lot of you know you know talk shows. I mean, sorry, a lot of people who claim to be experts in a particular field, but they're really peddling out either conspiracy theories, junk science, or junk history. And
Do you think Smith himself fits into that?
no, he's more of just a polemicist or kind
Yeah,
of
I just view
commentator.
I view Smith. I think if I were to say to Dave Smith, "Well, you're just a guy with opinions. You're not an
Yeah.
expert." I think he would cop to that. Actually, I
Yeah,
suspect.
yeah, he concedes that. He says, "I've never claimed to be an expert ever." But he would reply to Murray that that doesn't mean I can't have my own perspective on this. Though, and again, Murray's also right that if you are gonna speak on something like Israel-Palestine or vaccines or whatever, and you're gonna project it to a lot of people who are listening, then you have to know what the hell you're talking about and get basic, things right. You can't just spout off falsehoods that have already been disproved. Um, and Murray's also, I guess, right on that. And but then Murray's just no different to Smith in that sense. He's also a guy with opinions, a commentator. It's just that he has an Oxbridge accent and a PPE degree from Oxford. And
I think it's a
that,
degree in English too.
oh, sorry, degree in English. Sorry. Yeah, from Oxford. And that instantly, especially for Americans, that gives a little bit of extra credibility. But then Murray is also an ideologue. He's not just some like judicious scholar, and in a sense, there's nothing wrong with being a polemicist or simply a commentator or just a writer. Um, but with all these things, you have to have the humility to know what you don't know and um, to you know understand that just be curious and when you look into a topic like Israel Palestine, you have to really go into it. You can't just have a confirmation bias and start selecting things to squish into your own ideological narrative. And anything that contradicts this, you don't engage with it at all. You just sort of think
Well,
you
that's
just
that's why
swipe
I
it away.
mentioned that Israeli historian, and I'm going to botch the name, but Yehoshua Parath. who, like I said, he became a little bit more right wing in his own personal views about
Yeah,
how to solve the conflict.
yeah,
But I mean, he agreed with Finkelstein about Joan Peters from time immemorial. He said it's
yeah,
garbage scholarship. So even though he may have not agreed with Finkelstein on his
yeah,
polemical views, they agreed on the scholarship. And this is the problem I have with someone like Murray, where I don't think Murray is actually a historian of the conflict. And I
no,
think, ultimately his reporting with the IDF, there's a difference between, and Israeli said this to me recently from Haaretz, said, well, there's a difference between getting a press pass and being put on a propaganda tour. And,
yeah.
what bothers me about the Murray stuff the most is that I, I agree with him that Rogan has, uh, what's the word, boosted people that are not credible. And I consider Murray one of those people, to be honest.
Yeah. And also another point he made is that, today's student is that, well, in order to understand the country, how can you talk about a country if you've never been to it? So he's basically saying, how can you have all this talk about Israel if you've never been to Israel? And it's like, there's a point to it, but there's not really a point to it. It's like, if you go on a propaganda tour sponsored by the IDF, where they show you what they want to show you, are you really being enlightened, or are you just being soaking up propaganda? It's like it's one thing if you go to Israel, you and you talk to Israelis in Tel Aviv and or even in the settlements in the West Bank, and you go to the Palestinians in Ramallah and try to have this well-rounded perspective and you get a sort of personal feel, a very intimate feel for the conflict. But then if you are,
Isn't there also an issue with I don't think a lot of journalists are allowed into Gaza.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean Gideon Levy I don't think has been back there in years because of
yeah,
certain like the Israeli
yeah,
government doesn't necessarily allow it.
yeah, and like if you are being allowed into Gaza under the auspices of the IDF, I'm sorry, your perspective is going to be very limited, and it doesn't necessarily trump. I don't know, that on its own doesn't trump Dave Smith, who obviously has never been to Israel or Gaza. So you have to be very careful when you kind of use that kind of lived experience argument, you know. And you don't need to go be to Gaza and see the bombs flying down to know what Israel's doing is not very good, to put it lightly. You know?
Now, this gets into something bigger because Murray is criticizing Rogan for not having more balanced experts on. And like I
Yeah.
said, to me, that's a pot calling the kettle black because I really don't consider Murray an expert. I mean, maybe I'm being too harsh, but I feel like a lot of Middle East scholars would not take Murray that seriously. Um, so, but despite that, I mean, he raises that point that,
Yeah.
well, you're a person that has guests that are considered credulous on, even
Yeah.
outside of the Israel-Palestine stuff, having
Yeah.
Graham Hancock on or
Yeah.
pseudo-archaeologists.
Yeah.
And you talk a little bit about that and how Rogan's sort of in a corner now where he can't really, he has to have these sort of guests on that contradict an official narrative because the audience wants to believe that they have access to hidden knowledge.
Yeah.
There's a sort of incentive structure to Rogan's show.
Yeah. Because when when let's say if we were talking about this 8 years ago, because Joe Rogan has had these conspiracy theorists on ever since he's had the show. You can find shows from 8 years ago where he's having weed-fueled conversations with Alex Jones, right? And back then, nobody really took any notice of it, or it wasn't like a big thing because it's just a Joe Rogan show. It had its own sort of niche. But then, because Joe Rogan show's now ballooned to this mega show and it's like too big, now if you were to have a conversation with Alex Jones, it does become a problem because it is kind of seen as a show people listen to, not just simply to be entertained, but to be educated on, to learn something about that they didn't know before. So now he's like in a catch-22 because if he does bring on more establishment like historians or theorists or
Why do you, by the way,
commentators,
why do you use that? People are only going to be listening to this. They won't
yeah,
necessarily see the video. So you keep saying establishment in quotes.
yeah, because what I think Murray means is like mainstream historians or the sort of people who appear on CNN or write for the Atlantic, that kind of official credentialed people like, and obviously Rogan has actually had a few of them on, to be fair to him. Um, but if he were to say do that in relation to say Israel-Palestine, that would kind of taint his credibility um, with a big part of his audience who listen to him because they want that forbidden knowledge that they think they're being denied, that everybody's keeping away from them, that nobody knows, but only they know. And it's kind of ironic because Joe Rogan, over this Ukraine stuff, like um, Zelensky and Klitschko offered to go on to his podcast to explain their perspective on the Ukrainian conflict because Rogan was, obviously has been platforming people and even sent himself perspectives on Ukraine that are more critical, shall we say, of the pro-Ukraine position, and and obviously he rejected Klitschko's and Zelensky's offer, which it's surprising in Klitschko's case because Klitschko is a former boxer, and obviously Rogan's into UFC and combat sports, so that could have been like even interesting for his own audience. But so then, but then Rogan, rejected us, and I'll get on who I think are interesting and all that. So,
I wanted to
yeah,
ask you with that. I mean, I liked how you used establishment in quotes even in the article because this could get me in trouble for people that'll say I'm being too pro-establishment. But I think sometimes people underestimate how much diversity there can even be within the establishment. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
depending
yeah,
on
yeah,
it would depend on how you define the establishment, right?
yeah,
Like someone like Stephen Walt, the foreign policy commentator, I mean, he's very much embedded into the establishment. He writes a regular column for foreign policy. He's part of the
yeah,
CFR, but he has views that are kind of provocative to some
yeah.
people within the establishment. And like at certain points, I don't know what we mean by establishment anymore because you'll find more diversity if you dig deep enough, especially in
Uh-huh.
foreign policy circles. I think
Yeah,
there's more lively debate than people admit.
yeah, or even like John Mearsheimer. I mean, you could say
But
Joe
well, yeah,
Rogan.
Mearsheimer's even more well known than
Yeah,
Walt. Yeah, they work
yeah.
together, but yeah.
Like Joe Rogan could have John Mearsheimer on, who is agree or disagree with him. He's you know, an establishment foreign policy like theorist and lecturer and intellectual who's written the book on the Israel lobby that got a lot of heat at the time, and his view on the Israel-Gaza war is very different to, I don't know, shall we say, the more mainstream, or certainly very different to the Douglas Murray perspective. But Mearsheimer is not a crank or someone who, will just blurt out conspiracy theories, whether you agree or disagree with his overall takes on the conflict. And I don't agree with everything, Mearsheimer says, or whether on Ukraine or Gaza or whatever, Uh,
I was going to say in
yeah,
regards to that, one of the points I made about this debate was just take figures like Alain Papé, who is like
yeah,
vehemently anti-Zionist, new historian, Benny
yeah,
Morris, who is vehemently pro-Zionist and very right-wing.
Yeah,
or even Finkelstein, who, I think he can be a sort of a flamethrower at times.
yeah,
I would say they're all polemicists on
yeah,
some level. But the difference is between them and Murray is I think they've done real scholarship. I think
yeah,
Finkelstein did do an important service debunking aspects of Joan Peters' book from time immemorial. I think Morris, even though I'm not a big fan of his views on Israel-Palestine, he's done real scholarship. Same with Pape. And what I find interesting is I think people have a hard time differentiating between scholarship and polemic.
yeah. I mean,
Do you agree with that, or?
yeah. I think because look, every it's like with history. Let's say Eric Osborne, very he was openly Marxist historian of the even apologetic of the Soviet Union type, and he was very open about it. He never hid it or tried to pretend otherwise. Yeah, he wrote the Age of Trilogy, Age of Revolution, Age of Capital, Age of Empire, which are three of the best books you will ever read on the history of modernity. And it's been affirmed as such by Neil Ferguson, who is a right-wing liberal historian and very much not a Marxist. So if someone can write a work of history, proper scholarly history, yet even from a perspective from their even from a, they have their own political, personal views, which they don't hide. The problem is when you start passing off your own view as as scholarship and trying
And
to
there's,
really
like we
blur
said,
that.
there's some people that can toe that line. I think
Yeah,
Finkelstein has engaged in polemic. I think he's also done
yeah,
scholarship. Same with the other people
yeah,
I mentioned. But I think we're at this point where people have a hard time distinguishing between facts
yeah,
and, well, what's just the polemic? Yeah.
yeah. What is a fact and what is an opinion? What's your interpretation of said facts, and how do you support your interpretation, etc., etc. And I th I don't know. I think because our whole commentator sphere is very different because obviously you have the whole podcast ecosystem and we don't know how to have quality control, if I could put it like weirdly like that. Like
Well,
how do you
I think
yeah,
there's also like a blood sport element to the podcast scene, the blood sport debates where,
yeah,
debate is about, in the podcast sphere, debates are about you have to destroy the other person's arguments. Because there's a spectacle element to it. It's almost like watching a wrestling match, right?
yeah,
It's not like a debate where you're both trying to come to whatever the truth is,
yeah.
and I don't know. I feel like the podcast sphere incentivizes a certain way of looking at the world.
Yeah, that's
I hope that
true.
makes sense, but
Yeah, and it's funny because when Joe Rogan started, I was meant to be the opposite of that, that you have like a very deep, like really intense conversation, get into the nuances of these like questions and just take it wherever it goes. And now it's like, uh, oh, Dave Smith versus Douglas Murray, who will win, you know?
do you think there's an element of you need to sell these podcasts and make them entertaining,
Yeah.
or even just beyond podcasts, whether it's like CNN or any type of media. It's
Or yeah, Piers
no one
Morgan.
wants to. People don't want to watch a C-SPAN lecture,
Yeah,
or a debate done by the Carnegie Endowment. They
yeah,
want the big fight. And the
yeah.
trade-off is you're not necessarily going to be super educated by those kinds of like, blood sport debates or just shouting matches.
Like even listening, yeah, have you watched Piers Morgan? Like his show, Talk TV?
I
Like,
call that Jerry Springer for British people. But
yeah, that's the classic example where you'll have, I don't know, Douglas Murray versus, you know, Rania Khalek or someone like that. It's like, and it's like the whole point is the spectacle. That's why Piers Morgan
and you're also
does
hearing
it.
it in sound bites.
Yeah, it's like 5 minute sections where two people just shout at each other, I don't know, over who's the bigger killer, Israel or Hamas or something like that, you know?
Yeah, and for me, that's what I think your article was different than my perspective on it. My perspective was, oh my God, our discourse has become so degraded, and it probably isn't even degraded. It's probably been this way for a long time. But I feel as if we're not actually learning much from these kind of podcast debates, and maybe that makes me elitist in a way. I don't know, but I just I I don't feel like I got much out of watching Douglas Murray and
No.
Dave Smith for 3 hours. I feel like I would have gotten more out of reading an actual book.
Yeah, that's precisely.
But I don't think people want to do that. I think they want the instant gratification of hearing a debate and thinking they figured it all out.
Yeah, and I don't know,
Do you have a
because
Marxist analysis there of what I'm talking about, or how would you look at what I'm saying from a Marxist perspective?
well, I suppose the way we've communicated with each other has changed, like because people, well, it's just the fact that less people read just for pleasure, let alone for education. Like they listen to a podcast, or even like the whole traditional media is declining. It's just like the way we interact with one another is just so different because I suppose for my generation, I was born in 1996, and it seems like my generation was like a transitional generation. That we were the generation that were starting to grow up with the internet and social media in a really big way. And I suppose you could see how that has just changed how we communicate with each other, how we learn, how we, consume materials, like, and because like people don't have like I suppose the patience to read a 286 page book. Forget not even scholarly book, just say written by a popular journalist, like on, the Israel-Palestine conflict. People don't want to read that, but they're willing to watch some YouTube short that's like 90 seconds long from some podcaster, whether it be Rogan or Hassan or whoever, putting up some soundbite and like, yeah, that's now I've gotten the whole conflict. Now I understand this whole issue that's been brewing for 100 years. You know, yeah,
Yeah, it's
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 just
kind of insane to think that there's people that will assume they understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because they listen to Dave
uh,
Smith and Douglas Murray.
and
But I think there are people that think that way about it.
yeah, and this it can and when you have that perspective and you encounter a view that really contradicts it, and people don't know how to respond to it or how to engage with it, it's like, well, I've never heard that before. And if they feel really challenged by it, so it's like rather than engage with it or say, I'll look into that, they'll just become really defensive and like become counter aggressive, like, no, you're wrong, you know, you've got blood on your hands, no, you're the child killer, no, you're the child killer, that sort of thing.
Now, at the end of the day, I think you come down on the side of, well, for all the problems with these type of debates that Joe Rogan would host,
Yeah,
ultimately he's providing a valuable service. So I've been very hard on, this debate because, like I said, to me, I just found it very, I don't find it compelling. I really don't. But for an average audience, maybe there is some value in this because it does show the fault lines that exist in the right wing. Do you want to talk a little bit more to that?
yeah, I think I'm because I do like adversarial like conversations, and I do think there is a value in that. Now, maybe Dave Smith and Douglas Murray aren't the best candidates to prove that point, but I do think maybe it's just the old Socratic method in me that I still believe in that you have, the old dialectic that you can only find out how true your own view is if you subject it to challenge and scrutiny and, you know, have an engaging conversation with someone else with it, rather than, having being trapped in your own bubble where you just soak in the same stuff over and over and over and over again. So I think with Rogan or any other podcaster, I think, there is a little bit of value to it in the sense that at least from if you're an audience member, you at least know, okay, now I know what these two really think and how they relate to each other, and it's now my choice whether to, look into it further or which side I believe in, so that I can make my own mind up on it. So, and even, yeah, and obviously there's the entertainment value, which isn't nothing. Sometimes, a little bit of entertainment or edutainment can be good as well.
That's true, but I always see, I agree, but at the same time, I'm like, maybe we've gone too far into the edutainment.
Yeah, and it's because obviously Douglas Murray has his, like, I guess I wouldn't say cult following, but he has an audience who will listen to anything he says. And I think his appeal is because I don't know, some people see a bit of Christopher Hitchens in it, right? They want that itch, because he's got that posh English accent. He knows how to do a put down of someone who's clearly stupid. Um,
Did you
he's
see the joke I made about Christopher Hitchens recently and
what
Douglas Murray? I
what
said, there's often been this joke made about Christopher Hitchens that Americans like Hitchens because of his accent and they think that
yeah
makes him smart. But
yeah
I said, Hitchens is at least worth listening to. For me,
yeah
Murray, I think is that criticism would be spot on bullseye.
yeah
I'm showing my bias there, but I do think they're very different characters. But you're right. I think his accent has a lot to do with his popularity.
yeah, and clearly because he attacks wokeness, he's pro-Israel, and obviously Hitchens wasn't pro-Israel. Um, it's just that style. Like people like that kind of style. But at least Hitchens had a bit more substance to him. At least I think so. So that's why his rhetoric had more power to it. Style is substance.
I mean, in terms of where do you think this ends up from here? Like, is this ultimately a good development that we're having these debates, even if it's not in the most
Um,
intellectual of platforms?
well, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but I guess it's just like this is where we're going, isn't it? It's just like, um, I mean, there overall, I don't I don't think it's gonna make things better in terms of, I don't know, elevating the level of discourse around, because I think there's so many variables that have produced this thing. I don't think
We
where
we like
who
to think that
yeah
are in control of the discourse, but we're kind of
yeah
shaped by all these outside variables.
yeah. So I don't think who Joe Rogan has on his podcast is really going to change all that much.
And is there anything else you wanted to say about the article that I didn't cover?
No, I guess not. I mean, I suppose really what the underlying issue is within this Smith-Murray debate is the position of the United States, foreign policy. That's really what they're. Should America be, I suppose, a hegemon or the hyperpower, which is what I think Douglas Murray would believe in, or should it not be, which is what Dave Smith's perspective is. And I think because Douglas Murray comes at this, his whole thing is that as a neoconservative, like the West is undergoing a kind of existential crisis, and you see it with mass immigration, wokeness, multiculturalism, uh, the increasing popularity of pro-Palestine protests in the West, which he sees as existential to the West because I've even heard him say that if Israel were to stop existing, however one defines stops existing, he says that the West will fall. Like he has sort of put it in those terms. And and and
That's a
then you
very grand
yeah.
narrative, isn't it?
Yeah, like that's yeah, because that's his whole like thing, and he's written about it in books. His books from The Strange Death of Europe, which is about immigration in Europe, or The War on the West, very James Burnham like title, um, which is about debate about education, wokeness and all that sort of stuff, culture wars, basically. Um, and then you have Dave Smith, who clearly represent this perspective that comes out of the war on terror, that sees, we've America's been involved in all these forever wars, Iraq, Afghanistan. We're we're involved in Ukraine. We're involved in Israel. We've got all these military bases. People are clamoring for war with Iran. It's like, and his whole thing is, haven't we have had enough of this? Do we really need to be doing this? Do we really need to be running the world? Can't we just be in our own little space and just leave it at that? And also, as a libertarian, he sees like this empire, shall we say, as an extension of the state. And obviously, as a libertarian, he wants to reduce the state.
I
So,
hope this
so
isn't like too much of a deep cut, but do you think there's
yeah,
maybe a problem that both Smith and Murray potentially have where they collapse categories or collapse ideas or even collapsing movements or ways of thought? Like I think Murray has a very collapsed view of the Palestinian movement, of
yeah,
Arabs.
yeah,
Smith probably has his own ways of collapsing things. These are not figures that are disaggregating subjects or
yeah,
disaggregating categories, and in a way that can lead to a skewed picture of
yeah.
whatever the
Because
reality is.
Murray's whole worldview is very influenced by the clash of civilizations.
I called
Obviously,
him a dime store
yeah,
Samuel
so,
Huntington
yeah,
recently.
yeah. That is, and I'm not joking. That is his perspective. Like, it's very influenced by that. Um, Especially when you hear him talk about Islam, Muslims, and even though he sees Israel-Palestine through this perspective, which is, he'll say Hamas or the Palestinians, or he'll use Hamas as the standard for the Palestinians, have this kind of death cult, fanatical, blood-curdling culture and ideology, and Israel is like the on the front lines of Western civilization that has to defend itself from this ideology, while we have these masochistic woke people who are undermining this from within. So he's clearly an ideologue who has a very ideological like narrative, whereas Dave Smith is like, and his anti-war libertarianism, it's like trying to it's like, and this is kind of what you find with libertarians more generally, is that they want to try to turn back the clock to America before Woodrow Wilson came to power, basically, and it's like, and this is where the Marxist in me comes in. It's like the problem is that certain necessities have grown up where that's not really possible. It's like,
My thing with
yeah,
libertarians, to be honest, is I think they try to fit things into philosophical concepts that sound very nice on paper, but can't
yeah,
always be played out in the real world. Namely, like the non-aggression principle. It's like,
yeah,
yes, this sounds very nice, but I'm not sure how we apply this.
yeah. And that's the thing, because that's why they call themselves classical liberals, because they think everything went to pot with Woodrow Wilson. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature, but with the whole rise of the progressive movement in the early 20th century. And, that's why a lot of these anti-war libertarians think the American Civil War was a bit of a mistake. That really Abraham Lincoln was the real villain part in the American Civil War because they see that the rise of big government or the state or the American empire has its roots in the Civil War. And in a way, that's kind of true. Um, but this idea that you can somehow just tear it all down and go back to that kind of era is just not possible. It's like, you know, and even the American empire, it's like, in a way, there is a necessity for it. Because, with the way capitalism has evolved and directed, it's like, even even if America doesn't want to do it, someone has got to do it. Someone has got to manage this world order, this uh or should we say global economy. It's like there is going to be great powers under capitalism. And that's where they don't kind of see it because
My
they
view
don't
is that
yeah,
even, I mean, the great fear I have is, a lot of people talk about multipolarity,
yeah,
and I don't necessarily think unipolarity
good. Or,
is good. I
yeah,
mean, here's the thing: I don't consider bipolarity, unipolarity,
yeah,
multipolarity. None of these are like utopian conditions because
yeah,
we don't have a utopian condition. My
yeah,
view on multipolarity is it will probably involve a lot of nation states acting very paranoidly as nation states are wont to do and bullying smaller countries. And it won't be like the utopian alternative to unipolarity. But I don't
yeah,
see either as being that
yeah.
neither
So
are ideal.
yeah, neither is good because you still have the same problem under capitalism. Like it's still the same thing. It's just put in a different way.
What do you think that problem is, out of curiosity? Is it a matter of resources?
No, it's not just like resources. It's because capitalism is a global system, you know, combined and uneven development. So you have, you know, various states, you know, this is why imperialism is a thing. Imperialism in Marxist terms is the whole global system, and that can lead to, well, see, warfare and you need and because capitalism is managed on such a global scale and so complicated, like you're gonna have different states that are trying to manage it, and those states can come into conflict with one another, and
Can't or
that's
can?
sorry, can. I
Okay,
don't
okay.
I don't want to say it's inevitable or like there's some kind of mechanical process that it's always
Yeah, I
gonna
mean,
happen. Yeah,
this doesn't necessarily come from a Marxist perspective, but I think more from like the international affairs sort of realist school. I tend to think that nation states are pretty violent and paranoid
yeah,
entities, and I think
yeah,
we live in an anarchic world system that incentivizes them to be that way because they're always fighting over resources, status, or power, and they're always worried about an outside threat. And short of a different international system, I don't know how we
yeah.
change that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not.
And I think Marxists may
Yeah,
have some overlap on that.
yeah. There is certainly an overlap between Marxism and realism, at least on that score. Like, certainly one realist maxim is from von Clausewitz, though, when he says, "War is politics by other means," and I think Marxists would agree with that. That's what war is that when states can't negotiate with each other politically, they use war to do it. And war is always a kind of negotiation with guns and rockets.
Do you think what's your basic assessment of Murray out of curiosity? I know this is
Well,
beyond the article, but what do you make of his views on Islam and his sort of clash of civilization? I sometimes think that people like Murray or predecessors like Daniel Pipes and Pamela Geller
yeah,
engage in a form of anti-Islam thought that has parallels to anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, I reviewed Murray's book Strange Death of Europe
I did
around
not realize that.
7 years ago, and where I start it where I basically implicitly compare him to, you know, Lothrop Stoddard, who was
I'm familiar with that, but I'm not sure my audiences are.
yeah, because if you read The Great Gatsby, like Fitzgerald like satirizes this guy called Goddard who wrote this book in the early 20th century called The Rise of the Rise of the Colored Empires or something like that, where he basically said
Yeah, the
that
book was The Rising Tide of Keller
yeah,
Against White World Supremacy, 1920. Yeah.
yeah, where he basically because this was after the First World War, and you had this sort of view from Stoddard and Spengler where they feared that the racial hierarchy that was established is gonna now fray because of these new nations, the rising tide of colored people, and basically you're saying that it's basically like a precursor to the Great Replacement theory. And Murray peddles a very soft, hyper intellectual version of that without the overt like because
Overt
Stoddard
eugenicism and whatnot,
yeah
yeah.
because Stoddard was a overt Nazi KKK sympathizer, and the difference is that with Murray and Demlot is that Stoddard talks explicitly in terms of race and use that kind of biological eugenicist
Whereas Murray
language.
would talk more in terms of like identity, European
I
identity. Yeah.
Identity, culture, heritage, religion, and yeah, so he peddles a very soft version of that,
Is
and
there though? I'm not trying to like be grill you, but do you think there are
yeah,
structural similarities between sort of like hyper anti-Islamic sort of commentators like Murray and or what I guess some people would call it Islamophobia and
uh-huh.
anti-Semitism?
I would the better comparison would be with anti-Catholicism in the
Okay.
19th century.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm very interested in that because I've read a lot about anti-Catholicism as a Catholic.
Yeah, because in the 19th century, certainly in America, when you had a lot of Catholic immigrants from Poland, Ireland, Italy, etc., like there was a lot of anti-Catholic nativism that arose in America, and the arguments they would use against Catholicism sound very similar to the ones you would hear about anti-Islam today, which is one that these Latin cultures are incompatible with Republican government because the people founded the United States were Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and that is the cultural ground on which we stand on. And these Catholic cultures, which are very clannish, it's going to be incompatible with it. And two, another thing is that these Catholics are more loyal to the Pope, popery, than to the state here. And that has this analog with this idea that Muslims are incapable of integrating with, I don't know, British values or American values because they're more loyal to this transnational Islamic Ummah, that sort of thing. Um,
I could see how that would be more comparable to
yeah,
anti-Catholic thought. I mean, I do
yeah,
think there's comparisons. I always see certain right-wing anti-Islam folks talk about, well, you can never trust the Muslims because they
yeah,
engage in taqiyya, which is,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I do think that's similar to anti-Semites that will always talk about, well, never trust the perfidious Jew. I mean, I think there are parallels, but I think you're right too. At the same time, that the
yeah,
anti-Catholic thought
yeah,
has a lot more in
and
common.
also like criticism of because they'll say like stuff like Catholics abuse their women. They're very, and obviously you'll hear similar stuff about how Muslims abuse their women, e.g. the veil, the hijab, all these kind of cultural type criticisms that were applied to Catholics also apply to, Muslims. Like they're even with Catholics, they're ostentatious churches, because Catholics really like, the colors and all that with their churches. And you compare it to how even the discourse, say a new mosque comes up in any, in a particular area, they'll say how, that mosque, it looks kind of intimidating, doesn't it? It's a bit of an eyesore, isn't it? With the dome and the minaret or spire. There are kind of similarities, but I can see the similarity with with anti-Semitism, in certainly in this sense that obviously ever since the end of the Enlightenment there was this thing called the Jewish question, like how are Jews gonna integrate into our society? Should we assimilate them? Should we just reject them or what? You find a little bit of that with the discourse on Muslims, that nobody uses this phrase, but it does seem like we're taught ever for, I don't know, 30 years, ever since you could say the Salman Rushdie affair, we've had this discussion called the Muslim question. Now nobody uses that phrase, but it's really the same thing. Like, how are they how are they compatible with our culture? Can we integrate them into our society, or are they just so different, so culturally alien that we can't have them? Hence this discourse about Muslim immigration in particular, that, well, Ukrainians, they're kosher, but Afghans, I'm not so sure about them.
If you can give a few more minutes, I wanted to ask you. You write in this piece at UnHerd, there is no simple solution tied up in a bow to this problem when talking about free and open debate in the free and open public sphere, and even debate about Israel-Palestine. Do you think there's an issue where we're culturally? I don't think it's incentivized for us to have epistemic humility. Do you think that plays a role in a lot of things?
Oh yeah, because nobody wants to be asked something and give an answer that says I don't know, or I'm gonna have to look into more into that. I'm not really so sure about that, because I don't know, because nobody wants to come off as ignorant or you don't know anything, because it seems like you're like deficient, like you're lacking in some way. But obviously, as Socrates once said, that the true meaning of wisdom is knowing that there's some things you don't know, you know.
Well, our
And
knowledge is always incomplete. Therefore, we're
yeah,
always learning. The wisest man is he who realizes he's always in the
yeah,
process of learning more.
yeah. So, and a lot of people that find it hard to just accept that, because you know, so I guess some people rather give some nonsensical BS answer that they just came up on the spot, rather than saying, actually, I don't know about that. Uh, I'll have to look into that.
Last thing here, you wrote a piece for Compact. I haven't had a chance to read it because it just came out. How Trump Stole the Future from the Left. Do you just want to give my listeners an overview?
Yeah. So this is really on something I guess I coined MAGA futurism. So, you know, with Elon Musk, with his plans about Mars and colonizing Mars, and Trump even affirmed it in the inauguration, that where he invoked manifest destiny, that America will reach into the stars and all that. So I think what it's about is how Trump and Musk and that whole crowd are setting forth their own like vision of the future, right? Which they still believe belongs to America. So it's seen through this very nationalistic perspective. But it's also about how even the very idea of the future has sort of frayed, especially within the left in recent decades, where sort of because the idea of the future has its links with the Enlightenment that, in the future things will get better, hence progress. Uh, but now the future seems like a site of fear, of catastrophe, climate breakdown, pandemics, etc. And what our role is to prevent that, to pull the brakes on it, to instead of, well, here is a vision of the future, you know, of a society where we can be more freer, things will get better, things can get better, etc. Is this, you know, even liberals, they have, that there is this like very technical understanding of the future. It's about GDP forecasts, so it's something you calculate and manage as opposed to something you seize and try to make. That's that's kind of like Trump, Musk still kind of have this kind of, daring, uh, I will remake the future with my own hands sort of thing. And there is a rational kernel to it.
In what way?
Like in the sense that they still like hold to this like bourgeois notion of progress that with human action that the that human potential can be expanded uh and improved upon. Even though I think what they actually say won't do it, won't actually achieve it under these conditions. But under different conditions, it could actually be used to emancipate. So, for example, in the 19th century, those capitalist factories were very brutalizing and dehumanizing. But socialists always said that under different conditions, which we will bring about, those same tools which were used to oppress and exploit can be used to emancipate.
This sort of was a lead-in, actually, for me to ask you one more thing, and I want to get your perspective because you come from a more learned Marxist perspective than I do.
Mm.
And that's, I think there's a lot of debate about, protectionism versus neoliberalism
Yeah,
in this modern sort of moment we're in with Trumpism and the second Trump presidency. Do you think
yeah.
some people are missing the possible nuances that exist in all of this when we just start debating, oh, well, should we bring back manufacturing or should we have more trade between nations? Because I feel like things are much more complex than that. I mean, of course, I'm kind of trying to get your opinion on the tariffs too, but
Well, on would like because it seemed like obviously from a if we really want to go from a classical Marxist perspective, is that even whether protectionist or free trade, it's still capitalism at the same day. Um, and with tariffs, it reminds me of like Bukharin. Like he wrote an article on tariffs and the idea how tariffs have changed. Like whereas pre-industrial revolution, tariffs were like kind of custom duties. It's like it wasn't like a kind of a weapon you can use for one state to outdo another state. Whereas in more modern times, that's what tariffs have become. It's like kind of like a way a state can use to gain an advantage on itself. And and I suppose I think what people feel a lot of anxiety of is that we're going into a post-neoliberal moment, that we're going through the biggest overhaul of the world order since Reagan and Thatcher, really, which is what we associate with neoliberalism. And what we're going through now is something post-neoliberal. And
and we don't fully know what that's going to look
yeah,
like yet.
yeah, we
Yeah.
don't know what that's going to look like because obviously with these protectionism and tariffs, like people you can look at it and say, oh, we're going back to a sort of, I don't know, post pre-World War II era sort of thing, multipolar. We have all these protectionist countries, tariffs all over the place. But then, and obviously, Trump is using all this to create a new world order, MAGA world order, where and it's weird how he wants how to have his cake and eat it because he wants to keep the dollar as the reserve currency, yet weaken it in such a way so that U.S. exports become more um, competitive, so that that's so that it allows U.S. to reindustrialize and become a manufacturing powerhouse again. But you know, and this is where I would just have to admit that I don't really know how the future's gonna go into, and nobody does because we haven't really been in this position for nearly 50 years, where the entire world, like international system is being overhauled and being rewritten and being recalibrated in a different way.
What do you think the Marxist perspective on all of this should be then?
Well, it would be the same which is that this is capitalism going through a different recalibration. And look, and the only route or the only way is international socialist revolution. If you really want to use a classical Marxist perspective, it doesn't matter if it's neoliberalism or protectionism or free trade or no free trade, it's still capitalism at the end of the day. And if you really want to transcend capitalism, it means, a more rejuvenated working class based movement to seize power in the major capitalist countries, which will be the European Union, North America, even China now.
Okay, and how can my listeners keep up with your work?
Go into my Twitter at buffsoldier_96.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.